And is he the most insufferable comedian of all time?
If you're invested in the comedy scene, there's a good chance you've heard of
Is it bertkreischer?
Bertkreischer. Having been in the entertainment business for well over 2 decades now, it's hard to find many comedians who can claim to have found his level of success, as he's tried everything from stand-up to podcasting, and even acting in major Hollywood productions. A socialite by nature, Bert has spent his career cruising his way to
In
success.
what movie is he in? I don't remember.
Utilizing his network of connections in the show business, from his friendship with Joe Rogan, to being taken under the wing of Will Smith, to many others. However, for all of the glamour and all of the money, Bert's career has been taking a bit of a downward spiral recently. From his excessive lying to his hugely
He's
inflated
an alcoholic.
ego,
So,
Bert has been hemorrhaging support in the last year and beyond, and while he maintains a solid presence in the world of comedy, much of his success on YouTube has been in steady decline. But how did it come to this? How does one go from being a titan in the industry to a complete joke to most, apart from the shrinking pool of his diehard fans? Let's explore that. Bert Kreischer, born Albert Kreischer Jr., was born on the 3rd of November 1972 in St. Petersburg, Florida. His family moved to Tampa soon after his birth, where Bert would spend his formative years. Unlike many
why
other
is it away in?
comedians, Bert had a pretty stable childhood, with his father working as a real estate lawyer and his mother working in early childhood development, which meant they could live fairly comfortably, eventually going to a private Jesuit high school. This very comfortable lifestyle would continue into his college years at Florida State University, where he never seemed driven to actually accomplish much of anything. And as a member of the Alpha Tau Omega fraternity house, he ended up spending most of his time partying, as well as developing his lifelong habit of drinking. Bert would spend 6 years at the university, majoring in English. Throughout his long college tenure, he managed to get a bachelor's degree in the subject, which, if you know anything about how college works, it took him 2 years longer than it usually takes. Over time, he garnered a bit of a reputation on campus for his partying antics. To most people, Bert Kreischer would have seemed like nothing more than a college frat boy setting himself up for failure due to sheer laziness and arrogance, likely nursed by his comfy upbringing. What no one could have expected, however, is that it was this persona that would eventually set him up for life. In 1997, after Florida State University had been declared the #1 party school in the entire US of A, the popular magazine Rolling Stone decided to write an article about the university in order to explore this world-famous party culture. We can't know the exact intentions of the writers prior to entering school
Party
grounds, but what we can
school.
say for sure is that for all the things they could have discussed in regards to FSU's party culture, the one thing that most got the interest of journalists was none other than Bert. Pretty much the entire article narrows its focus on him, discussing in detail the kind of life he led at this university. They described the kind of person he was, his jovial, easygoing nature, his shirking of responsibilities. They mentioned how he could never stop cracking lighthearted jokes and laughing just about constantly. In fact, the article went as far as to call him the funniest guy to have ever attended the university. They mentioned how he had run for office of his fraternity twice, first time making a speech in the nude, losing, and then a second time foregoing a speech entirely and taking in a pizza box, which earned him a victory. For most, this kind of article would have been a personal embarrassment at best, and potentially life-ruining at worst. But as we'll find out very quickly, this didn't really concern
Oh,
Bert.
that's disgusting.
At least,
What?
as a much different path in life had now opened up to him. The article quickly caught the eye of the masses, and Bert practically became an overnight sensation. His crazy story captivated the hearts of the general public, and perhaps more importantly, the eyes of Hollywood, as the movie director Oliver Stone expressed interest in turning it into an actual film. But negotiations eventually fell through, and the scriptwriters involved were sent home. One of these scriptwriters changed Bert's
Yeah, the
name
guy who did JFK, right?
and then sold the script to National Lampoon, which turned it into National Lampoon's Van
And
Wilder, starring
Alexander.
Ryan Reynolds, apparently without any involvement from Bert at all. Following his 15 minutes of fame garnered from the Rolling Stone article, Bert was given an opportunity to perform a stand-up in a club in Tallahassee called Potbelly's. The recordings of his stand-up are not available online, but from what Bert himself recalls, his stand-up lasted 30 minutes and was good enough to entertain everyone present. Following his relative success, Bert took the tape from the stand-up and ended up sending it to Jason Steinberg, who, while seemingly not impressed, invited him up to New York City to watch some stand-up shows, while he would work the door at the Boston Comedy Club, and where he could occasionally get an open mic. The historical record gets a tad murky after this, but what we do know is that at some point while working as a doorman, Bert is approached by Will Smith's production company, which offered him a development deal on the condition that Will himself had to give it a thumbs up. As the story goes, he meets Will 1 week later at a recording studio, where Will was recording an album, and Bert managed to impress him so much that Will invited him to a private screening of American Pie. Notably, whenever Bert recalls his story nowadays, he makes sure to talk about how he had been afraid he would get S8 on this meeting, and how he'd been mentally preparing for it all day, although he goes on to clarify no such thing actually happened.
And I called my dad and he was, how did it go? I said, great. He's like, really? I said, yeah, we're going to the movies. My dad's like,
Wait, is in American Pie? Huh? I don't
I go,
remember.
no, like, just we're going to the movies. And he's like, what, just you and him? I was like, yeah. He's like, where? I said, Planet Hollywood. And he goes, oh, buddy, I'm so sorry. I said, what? He goes, this is one of those casting couch things. Like, what are you talking about? He goes, I think he must have doing it. I go, what are you talking about, Dad? And he goes, this is very popular in Hollywood. I said, what do I do, Dad? Do I not show up? He goes, oh, no, no, show
Alright,
up. He goes, look, buddy, each cash checks. And show up. And Will Smith goes, what do you want to drink? And I was like, a Long Island iced tea. And he's like, okay. He's like, you like shrimp? I was like, I love shrimp. He goes, get us the best seats. And so I go, okay. So I get us the 2 best seats in the movie theater, right? And we watch a movie.
Regardless of the specifics behind their meeting, which remain dubious at best, one thing we can say is that the meeting seemed like it was a major success for Bert, as less than 5 months after this meeting, the production company would purportedly offer him his own sitcom. We don't know exactly how this manifested, as the sitcom doesn't seem to have ever been released, but Bert would eventually get his chance to star in a large production when he got a role in a CBS pilot for Life with David J. in 2001. Not much is actually known about the pilot, and even Bert only ever seems to mention it in passing, but on IMDb it is described as a failure. Around the same year, Bert got an interesting opportunity when he got to host The X Show, which is perhaps even more nebulous than the prior pilot, as there's very little you can find about it online, other than that it lasted around 2 years and included some very raunchy programming. Bert's so far unimpressive career would eventually take a turn for the better, however, as in 2004, after playing a very minor role in a TV show called The Shield, as well as performing stand-up alongside 4 other comedians on National Lampoon Live, New Faces Volume 2, he finally got his first break when he became the star of a made-for-TV movie called Hurt Bert, which would hit people's airwaves in 2005. The movie was quite simple. Supposedly inspired by a short skit on The X Show of the same name, the movie featured a number of clips of Bert performing all kinds of potentially dangerous stunts. It
Yeah,
had
it's like a jackass
from
film.
wrestling a very, very compliant and potentially slightly sedated black bear to getting in the ring with a very
Black.
able bull and even getting his butt waxed. This made-for-TV movie, which was seemingly somewhat successful for what it was, had never really garnered a ton of attention, and it sports a rather paltry 6.2 across its 24 reviews, with the only existing written review providing nothing but a brief synopsis and adding it was entertaining for what it was. In 2008, Bert
Maybe it's decent review, I guess.
would get another very unique opportunity when he was recruited to star side by side with the likes of Theo Von in the short-lived reality TV show Reality Bites Back. For the uninitiated, Reality Bites Back was a spoof on the kind of competitive reality TV shows that were huge around that time. Contestants would meet every week to perform all kinds of different zany challenges, but truly the challenges were not meant to decide the winners. Instead, the primary function was for them to serve as vehicles for the comedians to make the audience laugh. Those found to be the least amusing were the ones who would get kicked out soonest. Bert starred in 5 of the eventual 8 episodes of the show,
thiếu bò này trên thế
losing the contest in the 5th. While episodes are hard to come by, what's believed to be Bert's last stint in the show is available online. As you can see, his performance is not what you'd call highbrow comedy, and in fact, it's not far out of line from what people have found amusing about him from the beginning. Even from his college days, one of the most notable things about him was his overt exhibitionism for the sake of comedy. As mentioned, Bert didn't get that far, rather notably being
What is even happening in
beaten out by
this?
even Amy Schumer and having teetered on being dropped even since the last episode. Even though his tenure at Reality Bites Back was not exactly a glowing achievement, Bert continued on his path to fame unabated, and in 2009 he managed to land his own comedy special on Comedy Central called Comfortably Dumb.
My navigation system took me through Compton. Yeah, apparently it doesn't listen to the music I play inside it. And I didn't know until it was too late. It was like, take a right on Renshaw Boulevard and punch it. I'm like, what? Do not stop at red lights. Lock your doors. Roll up your windows. Go, 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 go. All right, let's talk about black people. Here we go.
This would be his first, and for a long time, only comedy special. Though not the first available online video of his comedy routine, it does illustrate the kind of humor he generally employs during his stand-ups, using his knack for storytelling in a way not too dissimilar from, say, someone like Theo Von, although their humor and phrasing is definitely different. Only a year later, on June 16, 2010, the Travel Channel would premiere a brand new show with Bert as a star called Bert the Conqueror. The premise of the show would center around Bert traveling the country, and as the blurb on Rotten Tomatoes says, celebrating local culture at its most adventurous, and experiencing the traditions that make each city and town unique. In reality, the show was mostly focused on taking advantage of Bert's self-admitted fear of heights and his knack for overreacting, as he would be brought on roller coasters, base jumps, human slingshots, and all other kinds of thrill rides.
This summer, Bert the Conqueror.
Are you ready? Okay.
He's conquering the country.
Oh God. Is this the right way?
For what it was, the show was a better outing than hurt Bert, as it managed to get renewed for a second season, after which it seems to have been canceled. At some point during the 2000s, Bert started working for a popular comedian named Jay Mohr, specifically working as his opening act. While not much is really known about this relationship, Bert himself talks about it quite candidly, and from his description, it wasn't exactly peachy. On an episode of Tiger Belly, he spoke about how Jay Mohr treated him less as a partner and more like an employee, even going as far as to clarify to Bert that that's all he was. In fact, later down the line, he would even claim that Jay had slapped him over the face for supposedly talking disrespectfully to his wife, only to apologize for it later.
And his wife said something about getting an episiotomy. I didn't know what that was at the time. And he said, that's funny, Mike's so big, she had to get an episiotomy before having sex with me. I didn't know what an episiotomy was.
And resorting to violence. This is
I said, what's
not
an
good.
episiotomy? And she whispered it in my ear. And I started laughing, and I was like, shut the fuck, that happened to you? And she was like, yeah, and he just smacked me. He's like, don't you ever talk to my wife like that. And I was like, what?
At some point during their working relationship, Bert describes telling Jay a story that had allegedly happened to him involving
This kind of crazy story.
comedian Tracy Morgan, after which Jay asked to use the story in his own stand-up since he had a much better impression of Tracy Morgan. The story itself goes something like this. Back in the day when Bert still worked the door at the Boston Comedy Club, a very popular comedian by the name of Tracy Morgan is invited to do a stand-up on stage. At some point after stand-up is done, he and Bert manage to go off into a back alley, and Tracy hands him a joint, which, after Bert takes a drag, Tracy claims is actually PCP. Panicked, he goes back inside and talks to one of the older comedians there, saying that Tracy had just given him PCP, at which point the comedian assured him that Tracy didn't do PCP and had probably just gotten him some green stank. Still, the comedian recommended he stay with the rest of the group for the night. Once everyone was done with their comedy sets, they gathered up and went to what Bert describes as a railroad bar. There, Tracy goes all out on ordering everyone in the club expensive champagne. This goes on for the whole night, and Tracy racks up a bill in excess of $4,000. Eventually, the waitress comes along to hand over the bill, and with Bertkreischer being the only white guy in the group, she hands it to him for some reason. This leads to an outburst from Tracy, who accuses the waitress of racism while making it very clear he would be the one to pay the bill.
¿Por that?
And angry, he flips over the table where Bert and the rest of the comedians had been sitting, at which point he is approached by the bouncer. Then a massive fight breaks out, during which Bert, still apparently on PCP and unsure if what was happening was even real, went outside to get some fresh air. After a couple of minutes, during which people kept flooding out of the bar, Bert sees multiple bouncers carrying Tracy Morgan, and they hurl him down the stairs and out of the club entirely, throwing him his shirt as he went, which he had apparently taken off during his champagne pouring spree. The story concludes with Tracy Morgan exclaiming, "Now that's how you get out of paying a check." While the veracity of the story is very, very up in the air, and I'd even go as far as to say it's likely made up, Jay ended up using it in multiple stand-ups. As far as we understand, he always credited the whole story to Bert pretty much the time he said it. However, it seems that at some point Jay Mohr decided it would be easier to just omit the part where it happened to Bert, and he began telling the stories as if it happened to him. The first time, as far as we know, was on the Opie and Anthony show, and an episode aired on the 16th of March 2009. In the immediate aftermath, it doesn't really seem Bert actually did much about this, as he and Jay continued to work together for a good bit after. Throughout, Jay continued to tell the story as if it was his own. In 2011, Bert starred as a guest in a comedy show called Master Debaters with Jay Mohr, specifically in the 8th episode. It was a relatively standard comedy affair, wherein the host and the guest would discuss a number of lighthearted topics as vehicles to make as many jokes as possible. The show overall ended up being a flop though, and recordings of it are difficult to come by. While there wasn't much drama around the story of Jay stealing a story back in 2009, this would not be the case forever. In 2011, when Bert first made an appearance on JRE, he told the Tracy Morgan story, wherein he clarified that Jay told the story in his stand-ups and that he was okay with that arrangement, further clarifying Jay didn't really use the story much anymore. Here though, he does take full ownership of this story, and once again expresses he didn't really care that Jay was using it. At this point, Jay and Bert apparently had a bit of a falling out though. In an episode of Podcast 1, Jay says how he's quite angry with Bert because him telling the story publicly now gave more ammunition to people who accused him of stealing other jokes. He then claims that telling the stories if it happened to him was something he asked Bert for permission for before doing it. Later on, during another JRE episode, Joe asked Bert about the whole situation. In it, Bert goes deeper into his own feelings on the situation, and for the most part, he's actually quite forgiving towards Jay for stealing the bit. Throughout, he puts much of the blame on himself for not actually standing up for himself when he initially told it. Joe Rogan himself speaks out in ardent support of Bert, finding Jay's actions to be quite detestable, and said that it constitutes stealing, to which Bert never outright says anything to contradict him. And keep in mind, Joe Rogan has a specific hatred of joke thieves, exhibited by him calling out Carlos Mencia, which ended up getting him dropped from his agency. Combined with the impassioned support of Joe Rogan,
It's a
Bert came out of this
classic.
far, far better than Jay, and if anything, the whole stealing of Bert's story likely hurt Jay's career. He would later go on WTF with Mark Maron, where he was asked about the situation by Mark. Jay clarifies he's practically never even spoken to Joe, and that he and Bert were no longer friends at that point due to the whole drama. He goes on to describe a slightly different story to what Bert had described. Firstly, saying that Bert had insisted on Jay telling the story. In fact, after the success it finds, Bert apparently insisted that he keep telling the story on every subsequent show they do together. He then continues to use this bit, and as time goes on, he says that after Bert had insisted so much on him saying it, Jay begins
Every time,
to think
this.
the story would just sound better if he simply started telling it as if it were his own story. He clarifies that he regrets doing so, alleging there were only 2 instances of him doing it. He says he's disappointed that Bert didn't really try to defend him from Joe's barrage of insults and stealing accusations, apparently messaging Joe after the podcast to defend himself. While this didn't tank Jay's career, Bert definitely came out the victor, as the boost in popularity given to him by Joe Rogan ended up setting the stage for the next 10 years of his work. And years later, on the Tiger Belly podcast, he continued to recall this story in pretty much the same way. As we've shown, Bert has always had a bit of an knack for storytelling, and this is perhaps best exemplified from his early podcast with Joe Rogan. I've shown you a little bit from them already, but let's dial it back in and narrow our focus on his very first podcast appearance. As we mentioned, Bert made his first documented appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience back when it was only just in its infancy, appearing all the way back on episode 73 in 2011. The appearance ended up being a success for Bert, so much so that he would go on to become a regular. It also becomes a demonstration of another
That was way back in the day,
to bertkreischer, which will
10
only
years
become more
ago.
common as time goes on. One of the stories he tells during this show is of a stand-up he had done, during which, allegedly, 3 black men had come out on stage and whipped out their manhood one by one to the amusement of everyone in the audience.
One dude gets up on stage halfway through my set, and he's like, "This is a real motherfucker. He's keeping it real talk right now. Real talk. You know, real motherfuckers getting the 305." And he drops his pants and shows the place goes bananas, right? They're like, oh, and it's the biggest, blackest. It's almost purple. It's so black.
The chances of this story actually being true are next to none, and it's hard to say for sure why he even felt the need to share it, considering that despite it sounding amusing, it doesn't really have much of a punchline. It's just like 3 black dicks. While not the first story of its type told by Bert, it is perhaps one of the first clear examples in recent history of something that Bert has probably entirely made up for no discernible reason other than to impress the terminally weed-stricken Joe Rogan. Aside from that, perhaps more importantly, in this first episode,
It's like Brendan's Hall.
so Bert alludes to what would later become by far his most popular bit to date, The Machine. The first time Bert had ever told this story was all the way back in 2006 on an episode of Loveline. As he explains it, in 1995 he was on a school trip to Russia, which had been facilitated by 2 Russian gangsters who had been hired by the school in order to ensure the students' safety. During the trip, students were not supposed to ever actually speak to these 2 mobsters, whom Bert named Sasha and Igor. But with Bert being Bert, instead of following the advice, he knocks on their door and attempts to talk to them. He tries to introduce himself, but instead of saying, "Hi, I'm Bert," which is what he meant to say, he said, "Hi, I'm the Machine." Becoming fast friends with the 2 mobsters, he ends up getting up to all kinds of wacky hijinks during his stay in Russia, like driving in a cop car. Eventually, this all culminates in the school group hopping on a train back to Moscow, during which Bert, due to his 2 mobster friends, gets involved in a train robbery wherein the 2 gangsters robbed a few train carriages. When they stopped in Moscow to be interrogated by the cops, the police allegedly recognized Bert as the Machine and took him into a station, at which point they spent the night partying. It goes without saying that this story is 1000% made up. It just never happened. Strangely though, if you try to research this online, you will find a couple of testimonies to the fact that at least some of it may be real.
The pig story, huh?
For one, he does seem to have actually gone to Russia for a trip, and there does appear to be some sort of incident during a train ride that he was on. But regardless of how much of it is actually true, Bert would end up telling the story in full on the next episode of the Joe Rogan Experience that he was a part of, where he pretty much recalls it in the same way he had on all the occasions prior. Joe in particular took to the story, and it seems he encouraged Bert to try and share it during a stand-up, to which Bert objected, at least at first. More so, Joe Rogan took such a liking to Bert that he made him part of his so-called Death Squad, a quasi-comedy group comprised of some of Joe Rogan's comedian friends, including Brian Redman, Tom Segura, Aaron Kleiber, Tony Hinchcliffe, and more importantly to us, Bertkreischer himself. Likely seeing the success he had with the first few episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience, and further spurred on by encouragement from Joe himself, Bert set out to make a podcast of his own. He constructed what he calls a $100,000 man cave, built primarily to be used for his podcast, which he wasted no time in getting underway. He titled it Bertcast. According to IMDb, the first episode of this podcast premiered on December 5th, 2012. While the first 300 episodes are not available on YouTube, they are on Spotify, including the first one. The podcast was and still remains a pretty standard affair. You have Bert talking into the microphone about pretty much anything that comes to his mind, pop culture, recent life experiences, and then he has different guests that come on to take up the slack every time. In the first episode, it was his dad, and in later episodes it could be anyone from family to other comedians. While analytics are hard to come by on a podcast this old, it seems Bert found some moderate success with the show as he continued to upload episodes unabated for years on end. All the while he continued to show up on JRE as well as other comedian shows, where he continued to tell his wacky and often unbelievable stories to then funnel the attention from those shows to his own. For the most part, there aren't a ton of notable things to talk about here, other than Bert's tendency to share more of the baffling stories on other podcasts, including knowing 2 kids without tongues growing up, and also seeing a kid be struck by lightning. The strange thing about most of these cases is that they didn't really seem they were intended to get people to laugh, per se, as he said them in an entirely straightforward manner, and unlike the bear wrestling story or the bull story, there's simply no way to prove them. Perhaps the most perplexing story he shared about his life was about when he had been a frontman in his high school band. He alleges that he had been approached by Mark Tremonti, who wanted to join his band, but he was just so good that Bert couldn't allow him to be in the band, at which point Mark left to form Creed, which if you don't know is a multi-platinum rock band, which found worldwide success in the late 90s and early 2000s. More so than any of the prior stories, this is perhaps the best example of stories Bert tells that many people view as one-up stories, or stories meant to one-up everyone else's stories. Like when you tell your buddy you had a horse growing up, and your buddy tells you he had 2 purebred Arabian stallions that he could also ride simultaneously, while playing his Game Boy Advance. Regardless, there was clearly an audience for these stories, and podcasts such as JRE seem to be eating them up by the dozens. Joe, being famously rather trusting of people
Alright, that
his friends, didn't really seem to question any of Bert's stories to any degree. Bert continued to find success both in the podcasting scene and the stand-up comedy route. However, the successes were not exactly anything major compared to what he would achieve later in life, which at the time, he had his own podcast, which got modest views, and he did pretty well on JRE, but fundamentally, he didn't have much of a leg to stand on his own, even in terms of his stand-ups. Besides this, he also got a gig as host for the show Trip Flip. The premise of the show was that he would walk up to random strangers on the street and offer them an all-inclusive vacation for free. Most people would refuse, probably thinking it was some sort of ruse to get them somewhere private and harvest their kidneys. The show ended up being quite successful for what it was, getting renewed for 3 seasons before being canceled for unknown reasons. In 2014, Bert wrote and released a book called Life of the Party Stories
yeah,
of
no thanks, I
a Perpetual
guess.
Man-Child. In it, he wrote about the innumerable amount of stories he had purportedly experienced, including being named the #1 partier in the US by Rolling Stone, the Tracy Morgan story, and perhaps more importantly for later, he once again retold the story of the Machine. Later in 2016, Bert got another opportunity to revise his role in Bert the Conqueror, with the show getting renewed for one last season. However, this would be the last thing Bert did with the company, as he ended his contract soon after. And as it turns out, this was the right choice. The same year, he would finally get his really big break in comedy when he started a Netflix special called simply The Machine. In it, he recalled in detail the story about his experience with Russian mobsters, which we've already broken down for you 3 times. Besides that story itself, which was the main focus of the whole special, the show also served to demonstrate many other qualities of Bert's stand-up. The most obvious of which, besides his storytelling knack, is the fact that he loves to do his stand-up shirtless. In fact, while his early stand-ups were always done while regularly clothed, pretty much every stand-up he would do following the 2016 special was without a shirt on, to the amusement of everyone watching. The special ended up being a colossal success for Bert, becoming quite popular over its lifetime, with an average of 7 out of 10 on IMDb across over 2,000 reviews. But even more importantly, Bert was allowed to re-upload the clip of the stand-up to his YouTube channel, and he did so in December 2016. What he probably didn't expect is that this small decision ended up being perhaps his biggest claim to fame. The clip became a hit, steadily gaining more and more views, already nearing 1 million by March. This was many times more views than any of his other videos from the time, which were getting an average of about 30,000 views apiece.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy amount of views
And
and
the steady
money.
growth only continued as by September the video had almost 3 million. Now, as of today, the video sits at a staggering 54 million views, and it's by far the most viewed video on Bert's YouTube channel. To the YouTube algorithm, this is a timeless classic. The video's success directly translated to a massive bump for his whole channel. He went from having just around 20,000 subs in around 2016 to suddenly having over 45,000 subs by February 2017, over 70,000 subscribers by June, and around 128,000 subs by the end of 2017. The channel had been around for over a decade by then, but within a year it grew almost tenfold. Perhaps more importantly for Bert at the time, however, the Netflix special was Bert's ticket to the mainstream, leading to another popular comedy special in 2018, as well as becoming the foot in the door for his Hollywood career. When you look at the early videos on Bert's YouTube channel, one kind of upload you'll see often is the sort of slice of life content you might see on vlog channels. These go all the way back to 2011, and as it happens, they're probably on the same level of quality as other YouTube vlogs from the time.
You tell me one comic you know that can do more of these than me.
Besides showing off his amazing push-up form, Bert had filmed a number of videos with his kids as well. That would change on October 10th, 2015 when Bert released his first official vlog video. You can tell there was a lot more thought put into the production aspect of this one, with proper editing and a decently high-quality camera. He would post these vlogs quite regularly at first, releasing a new one seemingly every couple of days, albeit without any real schedule in mind. In December, he released a vlog titled December Weigh-ins and 3-Day Weight Loss Total, where he opened up a bit about his weight problems, showing his weight to be 255.8 pounds. The video then focuses on his attempts to shed this extra weight, and he shares his intention to lose around 40 pounds in 2016. Bert would keep up this goal for a while, eventually losing about 20 pounds, but after the last video, it seems he dropped that goal for the time being. Later that year, around November 2016,
That's actually pretty good.
Bert released a short weigh-in video where he showed that he and Tom Segura had made a bet about who would lose more weight in 2 days. Whoever lost more weight would win the right to shave the other person's beard, which, as both of them
Insufferable, October or
made quite
something.
clear, was tantamount to murder for their jawlines. The whole event had been set up by Joe Rogan. Originally, it was intended to be a 3-day challenge, but for whatever reason, they shortened it to 2. This was obviously not nearly enough time for any meaningful weight loss, and the most they may have hoped to achieve was losing a bit of water weight. Regardless, both Bert and Tom weigh in on how much weight they would lose on each day of the challenge. On the first day, Bert apparently lost 6 pounds, and Tom managed to lose 8, going from 227 to 219. On the second day, Bert lost a further 1 pound and Tom lost 3. And as implied, Tom now had the right to shave off Bert's beard, which he took great delight in doing.
Bert, can I please see it? Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, so you're doing the prince.
And
Initially, the challenge's purpose had been to simply get both of them healthy.
it seems like a fun thing to do, I guess.
Although it seems Bert was the one who Joe was
Challenge.
more worried about. That said, it didn't seem like the challenge had really convinced Bert to change his lifestyle much, and given that he, Tom, and Joe were all quite close friends by that point, there's plenty of reason to believe that Bert's health was a matter of concern for all of them. And don't forget to add on top of that Bert's severe drinking problem, which had only compounded his health issues. Whether it was due to Joe's earnest concern for his friend's health or making an entertaining video, Joe would go on to create a sort of new tradition. In 2017, Joe, Bert, Tom, and another comedian by the name of Ari Shafir would get together. In order to support their friend, they would join Bert in spending the entire month of October without consuming any drugs or alcohol. The challenge then became known
Yeah,
as
this guy is actually crazy.
Sober October, and we can assume that initially the focus was entirely on helping Bert. During this month, the four would also have to challenge themselves to do 15 hot yoga classes throughout the month. At the end of October, the 4 comedians would get together to discuss their experiences throughout the whole ordeal. The impression they gave was that the overall experience was actually quite positive, with Ari in particular having demonstrated quite a bit of talent for yoga. While the group didn't share any hard data on weight loss, Bert definitely appeared healthier, speaking to the effectiveness of the whole program. Within a few months, he had started a new podcast called Something's Burning, which, while being a typical show on the surface, also had the added layer of Bert cooking a meal for his guests during it. Besides this, he would also release another Netflix special called Secret Time, which, just like the first one, became quite popular with the general audience, getting him a respectable 7.3 on IMDb from over 2,000 reviews. The impression was that Bert would try to maintain this healthy lifestyle somewhat, and to his credit, he even ran a marathon in March. However, Bert alleges that the marathon ended up causing quite a lot of damage to his body, making him unable to exercise for a month and leading to him putting on 15 pounds. The weight problem didn't get any better, and throughout 2018 he continued to balloon, causing even further concern in his friend group. According to them, Bert had alleged that much of the weight was due to bloat from all the alcohol he'd been consuming, which Tom Segura directly relates to Bert's comedy tour, referencing a common practice wherein Bert would always drink either prior to or during his stand-ups. Whatever the case, Bert's health was clearly taking a turn for the worst, which called for yet another intervention. In October 2018, Joe Rogan would organize yet another month of sobriety, renaming it to Sober October, presumably to make it less strictly about Bert. This time around, the rules would be slightly different than last time. Joe introduced a point system, wherein every time one of the contestants did something that elevated their heart rate to a higher percentage of their maximum heart rate for a given amount of time, they would get a certain amount of fitness points. The person with the most fitness points would be crowned winner and rewarded with a custom-made MMA-inspired champion belt. The introduction of a competitive angle ended up being quite effective, as everyone involved spent a lot more time on exercising, Bert included. While everyone did indeed put a lot of effort in, perhaps it shouldn't surprise anyone that Joe Rogan, a man who's been exercising non-stop for decades and who's the only one even approximating an athlete, won this challenge quite handily. As another year carried on, Bert did end up falling back into his old habits of not taking his health very seriously. Come October, the Joe Rogan crew would once again organize Sober October, although at this point it was clearly no longer for the benefit of Bert and had instead become a simple channel tradition, this time replacing the fitness point system with having to do at least 10 different courses, as well as read at least 500 pages worth of books. Interestingly, and perhaps somewhat worryingly, during the podcast where the third Sober October was being discussed and set up by Ari, he admitted to having spiked Bert's drink with MDMA. As the two described the story, Bert had been home with his wife and kids, and Ari had come around to visit. According to Ari, he was mad at Bert for getting him involved in
Yeah,
Sober
the story is actually crazy.
October, and as revenge,
I don't know what's wrong with this guy.
decided
Ari
to crack open an
Shafir.
MDMA pill and pour out the contents into his drink. Notably, Bert seems quite uncomfortable the whole time the story is being recollected, and while Joe and Ari seem to take it in good humor, both Bert and Tom are clearly taking this quite seriously. Bert detailed how as soon as he realized his drink had been spiked, he was having near constant panic attacks, not helped by the fact that he was supposed to go on tour the very next day. Among other things, Ari argued it wasn't a very big deal, partially because practically every time the moment October ended, Bert would go right back to drinking and living unhealthy anyway, meaning much of the point of Sober October was lost regardless. Oddly, this frankly terrifying story did not have much of an impact on anything. The Sober October continued unabated. More so, besides the stern talking to during the podcast episode by both Tom and Bert, which amounted to saying, that's kind of a dick move, Ari got off completely scot-free. In fact, he would go on JRE twice in just the next 2 months, and the MDMA thing was never really addressed. Regardless, the round of Sober October went largely the same as the other two, with the 4 contestants committing to the bit admirably. A recap of it was done in an episode of JRE in December, where all 4 would weigh themselves and compare just how much weight they had lost, with Bert clocking in at
This is barely cut.
237 pounds. But the tradition of Sober October will be put on hold from this point on until 2022. As we've likely established at this point, Bertkreischer and Tom Segura have been friends for quite a few years by now. They would often make appearances on each other's podcasts, with Tom appearing on Bertcast all the way back in episode 100 of Bertcast, over 9 years ago by now. Fair to say they've been quite close, and their mutual involvement with Joe Rogan only gave them space to strengthen their mutual friendship further. By this point, fans were begging them for a more permanent collab, and in mid-2019, the two would finally oblige. The Two Bears One Cave podcast released its first episode in June 2019. It was about as by the numbers as it could be, considering the two's other podcasts, but what neither of them may have expected is that it would arguably become their most popular piece of work. The first episode raked in a staggering 1.5 million views, and even once the initial hype died down, the weekly episodes continued getting anywhere from 700K to even a million views per podcast. While these numbers were pretty normal for the YMH channel at the time, and were at times even a bit lower than what the YMH podcast may have expected, it was still far more successful than Bert's own show, which would earn maybe about 100,000 views on a good day. That said, Bert's Something Burning show was doing a lot better, with episodes from 2022 getting upwards of 3 million views, but we can't really be sure of it as Bert has removed all the old episodes and then re-uploaded them after releasing the season 2. But considering comedians are always making new podcasts, this would of course not be the only new podcast Bert started in 2019, as later that year in October we saw the release of the first episode of Bill Bert Podcast. The show was a pretty standard affair for Bertkreischer, as he pretty much does the same thing everywhere he goes, with the addition of smoking cigars. Bill, meanwhile, provides a relatively new perspective, being a lot less patient with Bert's antics than either Joe Rogan or Tom Segura. While the Bill Bert Podcast is no longer available on YouTube, save for re-uploads from diligent internet archivists, we can assume it must have done pretty well as the show would go on to release 57 episodes. Both of these new podcasts show themselves to be quite successful, with both providing very, very different dynamics. While the Two Bears One Cave podcast had Tom mostly giving room to Bert to spout off about whatever, which made for a very entertaining show, the main draw of the Bill Bert podcast was the fact that Bill would just lay into Bert for even the smallest thing, and Bert would just have to take it.
I get confused really easily in our fights. I had one fight. Yeah, I get really confused.
God bless your wife. I was just picturing the dumb look on your face. Can you imagine being married to someone who gets confused in arguments? wait a minute, what was my point? And she stays with you? What a fucking angel you married.
It was with the release of episode 36 of Two Bears, One Cave that the way the show was run was
นี่
changed
ครับชุดละเป๊ะๆกัน
forever. And the most notable moment from that episode was a clip of Bert admitting on air that he drinks 1 gallon of Kool-Aid every day while Tom laughs uncontrollably from sheer befuddlement. While the episode itself did quite well, getting around 2 million views, the clip of Bert drinking Kool-Aid netted him over 6, and his subsequent short would go on
เพลงลาเพลง or something
to get another 4. It was exactly at this moment that the podcast saw somewhat of a shift in focus. While the main draw remained the dynamic between the two comedians, the topics they would discuss would shift somewhat from general podcast topics to putting more focus on Bert specifically, highlighting his constant partying and making light of his prevailing drinking habit. The gamble paid off massively for the Two Bears, One Cave podcast, whose views had begun to taper off somewhat prior to the 36th episode, revitalizing the channel and putting them back on top. At this point, it's fair to say that Bert was beginning to hit the absolute peak of his success. All his stand-ups were regularly selling out, and he was even getting more work in Hollywood. He got another Netflix special in early 2020 called Hey Big Boy, which, much like his other comedy specials, seemed to be quite successful. Around mid-2020, Bert even got to meet one of his supposed idols, Adam Sandler. During the short interview, Bert pretty much behaved as you would expect him to, telling some rather unlikely stories, presumably in an attempt to impress, sucking up to Adam and constantly
yeah
dropping
this is artwork
compliments, all while the seasoned actor just sits there and nods along politely, looking beyond desperate to just put a stop to it. As it turns out, the stop came very quickly, as only 5 minutes into that interview, Bert asked him a question so silly that Adam just couldn't stand it anymore, and he called it quits right then and there.
What movie was the funnest to shoot that you would shoot every single day for the rest of your life?
No answer for that. I got no idea. I never thought about that. I never will. And I hated that question. No, you ruined it, man. I don't ever want to see you again.
A rather embarrassing
and the question wasn't that bad
outcome for Bert, no doubt, but really, it wasn't even the most embarrassing thing to have happened to him that year, as you'll soon see. In October 2020, Netflix would release a brand new comedy TV show starring Bert as its main lead, titled The Cabin with Bertkreischer. The premise of the series is that Bert is moving into the mountains with the intention of detoxing, although the actual contents of the show are more about the supposed comedic hijinks that he and his guests get up to, all the while smoking cigars and consuming copious amounts of alcohol. While a number of the guests he invites on are his friends from the comedy world, some of the choices of guests are very confusing. In the second episode, for example, they invite Caitlyn Jenner, of all people, who's about as involved with Bert Kreischer as the bear in Act 1 of this script. The show is sort of supposed to be a mock reality show, with a number of scripted moments that are supposed to come off as real. At the end of each episode, there are calls Bert makes to his wife, Leanne, in which Leanne must feign complete ignorance to the fact that Bert is actually making a TV show on the supposed detox tour. Of course, the problem is that pretty much all these calls are hideously fake, and they don't do a very good job of pretending that they're not.
I feel perfect right now. I feel absolutely perfect. I feel like a monk.
So have you learned anything? Enlighten me.
Well, the Superman in Cuba had an 18-inch gold.
Oh.
And he Marlon Brando.
Okay, well, good night, babe.
The show's humor is undeniably edgy and crass, and while that's pretty standard for most of Bert's comedy, the only real part of his routine that's present in the show is his unapologetic exhibitionism and slapstick comedy, harkening back to the days of Hurt Bert. The show found some success with Bert's diehard fans, but otherwise it was panned across the board. The show had some truly baffling choices in terms of filmmaking, and frankly, even just plain comedy. It ended up flying under the radar compared to Bert's other much more successful ventures, and even the trailer for his show, which came out on Netflix's official channel, only garnered around 700,000 views, which for a Netflix show seems pretty low. The show's reception was not the only mark on Bert's record, as about 8 months later, in June, the last episode of the Bill Bert podcast was released, after which Bill unceremoniously ended it. While the specifics on why exactly Bill had left are unclear, there are certain assumptions we can make. On an episode of the Dan Lee Batard show, Bert explained that the reason Bill left the show is because he had been having a little grill party, and having to do the episode with an additional guest left him blindsided. Bert alleges that the podcast was pretty much the second to last time he had ever spoken to him, despite them having been good friends for over 20 years. So this spelled the end of the Bill Bert podcast, but this was hardly a problem for Bert, whose successes only continued to mount as time went on, and the show with Tom Segura continued to thrive in a way that not a ton of comedian podcasts do. However, even the Two Bears, One Cave show wasn't quite what it
นี่
used to
จะเก็บ going I mean
be. Around 2021, there came yet another change in programming when Tim and Bert would individually invite guests on the show, foregoing the other hosts entirely. Bert, in particular, ended up filming 3 episodes in a row with just him and the other guests, with Tom nowhere in sight. Conversely, excluding Bert also became somewhat common, as Tom would share the floor with whatever guest came on that day, from Tim Dillon to Brendan Schaub to whoever else you could think of, really. But it was also around this time that Bert started to personally catch some negative flack on the YouTube side of things. In prior years, Bert's friendly nature and extensive connections with other comedians kept him fairly safe from criticism. But as 2020 rolled into 2021, this spotless record would become somewhat tainted. While it's hard to say where and when exactly all this started, there are a few potential places we can point to. The first major takedown of Bert was released on the 11th of September 2021 by a YouTuber called Porcelain. The video is over an hour long and detailed the entire story of Bert up until that point, with a very heavy negative slant, calling him a deeply unfunny and untalented slob whose biggest claim to fame was his ability to mooch success off of other people. The video got around 800,000 views, which is a lot more than any other video on his channel, and while it got a lot of dislikes, there were also a lot of supportive comments who had been feeling the same way. Some other negative videos followed in the immediate aftermath, including a review of The Cabin with Bert Kreischer by Speaking of Funny, another relatively small YouTube channel. He calls out the show on being poorly put together, from the jokes to the premise, as well as giving more in-depth critiques of each episode, breaking down in short why they just don't work. He also accuses Bert of only inviting some of the bigger names like Caitlyn Jenner for the sake of gaining a larger following for himself. He then posits that the only reason the show was made was for Bert to pocket most of the production money and split it with his friends. The video did well for itself, earning around 250,000 views over its lifetime, and with the comments being generally supportive. While both of these videos did very well for what they were, they did little harm to Bert's reputation. They did very little harm to Bert's actual reputation. The hype around him only continued to blossom, and while Two Bears, One Cave was not the juggernaut it had been before, it was still a very popular show. Add to that his stand-up and his involvement with multiple Hollywood productions, and there really wasn't much cause for Bert to worry at the time. This rather tepid state of affairs would continue into 2022, with Bert continuing to find success in his own way, getting on podcasts like Joe Rogan, and steadily appearing on Two Bears, One Cave, as well as continuing to do Bertcast and Something's Burning. But even then, he was not entirely without controversy. Around mid-22 on an episode of Bertcast, Bert interviews fellow comedian Stavros Halkias of Cumtown fame, and during it he makes a truly baffling comment, drawing a clear distinction between the brains of comedians and so-called pedestrians, to which the most athletic Greek comedian of all time replies by laughing hysterically.
A comic's brain is so different than a pedestrian's brain. And like what, like I can't help. I went
Pedestrian is so funny, by the way.
Oh.
Like saying that.
The moment earned the
ยั
whole
นนอซอส
episode nearly 4,000 dislikes to 13,000 likes, a far worse ratio than Bert usually gets to enjoy, and the moment was even clipped and re-uploaded to YouTube in the form of shorts. Of course, this didn't really affect much in the grand scheme of things, but what it did do is highlight something about Bert that many have never even noticed, his inflated sense of ego. Although only a small thing at first, this train of thought that saw Bert as a bit of a narcissist began to slowly gain steam as the year wore on. In September, Bert made a guest appearance on This Past Weekend, where he spoke opposite of Theo
นี่
Von.
มัน Aquasis narcissist I mean
Not uncommon for Theo to discuss addiction, and he asked Bert if he's an alcoholic, to which Bert emphatically says he's not an alcoholic, despite getting severely drunk almost daily, and giving himself such life goals as not drinking while on a private plane. Given
imagine talking about yourself every day
there would have
man
been fewer Bert fans watching this episode, it's perhaps unsurprising that most of the comments under this clip speak quite negatively of him, pitying Bert about his obvious state of denial, while others mock him for it wholesale. The call-outs would continue throughout the year as Joe would stage yet another intervention of poor old Bert, who at this point hardly seemed to understand that the whole reason Sober October even started was to help him with his drinking problem, and would instead receive it as just another fun thing to do with the boys. These October streams would lead to perhaps the first time Joe ever actually called out Bert for much of anything, and it's not that difficult to see why. During the Sober October 4 stream, where they announced the beginning of the challenge, Bert kept making some truly baffling claims. For example, he insisted he believed himself to look a lot more in shape, despite clearly being borderline obese. He also made a wild claim that as a 50-year-old man with the flexibility of a plane of glass, he could probably do the splits.
Actually delusional.
Too wounded
Dead.
pride for actually being in shape and being capable of doing a split, or just being generally annoyed at Bert for constantly claiming to be better at things than he ever realistically could be, Joe called him out, giving him a bit of a reality check about both his health, his physical look, and the likelihood he could ever do a split in his life.
Yeah, like this is like when you go like, I have legit the best shoulders.
I do. Oh, I do. I have legit great shoulders. Like great shoulders.
Yeah. No, you don't.
Joe, they're ripping through this shirt right now.
Yeah, but you say things you don't really mean it, right? Like when you say things you know they're not true.
I
totally
does mean it.
He's kind of mean it. Right. But you say things you know aren't true. Like remember that one time you said you could do the splits? You were
I actually thought I might be able to pull one out.
This wasn't much, mind you, but it was the start of something larger, something that went even beyond the Joe Rogan experience and into the larger YouTube space. Joe would call him out slightly on a later podcast during a segment where they discussed Garth Brooks, and the topic of discussion switched to if Tom Segura would be willing to stop trolling him if Garth went on a podcast with him. Perplexingly, Bert went on a bit of a tirade, trying to make it as clear as possible that Garth Brooks would never go on a podcast with Tom, even interrupting him and Joe to get that point across. Joe tells him to shut the flip up for a second, and while Bert is temporarily convinced to shush, he still barges in to comment that Garth would probably benefit more from going on his Bertcast, which, personally, I dare say is almost guaranteed to be untrue, given the sheer disparity in viewership between YMH and Bertcast at the time. The call-outs would continue all the way up until the end of Sober October, when the quartet got together for a recap. The episode starts with all of them taking a supposedly well-deserved drink of a 20-year-old scotch, and of all the people sitting there, it's pretty clear who takes the most pleasure in having a sip of alcohol.
All right, here it is.
I
Cheers.
haven't had any.
Cheers. No alcohol to now.
31 days.
Gentlemen, we did it. Yes. To all you out there, too, did it with us. Salud.
Cheers.
Cheers. Baby, let's see what you think.
Ooh, that's good scotch. That's 21-year-old Glenlivet.
Very nice.
Downing his drink in one gulp, Bert finds himself asking for another shot almost immediately afterwards, to the chagrin of everyone else sitting around the table. Tom is the first to call him out here, pointing out that Bert takes a lot more pleasure in drinking alcohol than anyone else in the room. He goes on to say that, in his view, drinking copious amounts of alcohol has become part of Bert's whole identity. Bert gets immediately defensive about this, going on to say things like, my identity is drinking the same way as an identity for any other guy, or my identity is living life. Both of these statements lead to jeers from the host and the rest of the guests, who don't really seem to be taking these statements with even a modicum of respect. Notably, Bert gets quite snappy after this, randomly throwing in insults and just not looking like he's having a good time. In the end, it seems Bert is rather content to have this be the last episode of Sober October on record, and as of today, long after the end of October 2023,
แมนรับสากลนะ
it appears that this truly was the end of the multi-year tradition.
มา
The tail
สิ
end of 2022 going into 2023 would not treat Bert any better. For the first time, perhaps, since his appearance in the world of show business, there's grown a large population of people who genuinely just don't like Bert. This wasn't necessarily due to one big thing, one massive blunder that caused everyone to turn against him. Instead, it's been a slow, steady decline with mounting podcast appearances where he's called out for something minor, his comedian friends commenting negatively about him, and just people growing tired of his arguably quite samey style of content. It's now gotten to the point where even his Reddit page is mostly full of people actively rallying against him, either pointing out how annoying he was during his podcast appearances, sharing negative videos about him, or alleging that his so-called mystery bag is a scam. And on the note of those videos, 2023 was the year when they really began to hit their stride. Channels like Comedy Enforcement and Too Lazy to Try, both commentary channels focused mainly on news in the world of comedy and podcasting, started pushing out a lot of videos talking about Bert, consistently keeping him in the cycle. With these videos and many others like them, Bert's standing in the community grew even worse, and it seemed there was no end to things people could theoretically make videos of. In late 2022, Comedy Enforcement discussed Bert's infamous high-pitched laugh, focusing on an instance of it during an episode of Something's Burning, where Bert started laughing so hard and so ear-piercingly upon being called out for cooking some terrible food that he couldn't even stand on his feet. This was perhaps one of the first instances that the claims of Bert faking his laugh were first brought to the public consciousness, even if such claims had likely been made in videos
Yeah,
prior.
he's doing too much now.
Indeed, the laugh probably sounds at least a bit exaggerated, if not fake, to most of the people who hear it, with most of the comments calling Bert out on it. This rather minor point would go on to spawn multiple videos questioning just how real this laugh was. By the beginning of 2023, a lot of people really began questioning it, trying to find a reason why he would so often supposedly exaggerate these clips. It was during this time when clips like this started circulating. This excerpt from Bert's podcast shows him laughing uncontrollably at another comedian falling off the stage during stand-up. He barely stops to take a breath, but he continues to laugh incessantly for 2 minutes straight.
I've watched it 10 times. It's never that funny.
Make it stop.
It is worth noting that a lot of Bert's most viral clips over the years, including the now legendary Kool-Aid moment, were largely popular due to Bert's laugh, with the moments not having a ton of substance outside of that. While it can't be 100% confirmed that he fakes his laughs, or that this is the reason why he would, it's something worth thinking about, I guess. In fact, this perspective is perhaps even more worth entertaining than you may think. When Bert goes on the Fighter and the Kid podcast, he makes an offhanded comment that paints a somewhat interesting picture, saying he's always fishing for laughs and waiting for the right moment to let out a hearty one. Perhaps more damning is his admission on Joe Rogan, effectively confirming that all of his viral clips are basically just him laughing. This whole affair, while not exactly groundbreaking, did serve as one of the many points of contention that people would keep bringing up against Bert. However, it's not something people focused on for very long, as many other things would come to replace it in public consciousness. In March 2023, Netflix would release a new Bert comedy special called Razzle Dazzle, which Bert performed at a massive sold-out arena. The brunt of the comedy for most of the special was jokes about his family, with the latter half focusing on appeasing his podcast audience, which he seems to believe makes up a majority of his IRL audience nowadays. For what it was, the Netflix special was clearly very popular, getting a 7 out of 10 on IMDb, but in general just being well-viewed and very successful, and they made him a lot of money. However, as the show became more tailored towards a general audience, there were now more people looking in from the outside, and some of them would go on to comment about how they didn't like it. People like the aforementioned Comedy Enforcement came out to say he found the special quite lacking, and the comment section flooded with people showing general disdain for both Bert and the comedy special in question. The waves of tepid criticism only continued as YouTube became more and more inundated with people who find Bert insufferable. In April this year, Ghost Gun released a takedown of Bert, in which he explored Bert's very slow but gradual fall from grace, the way some of his own fans are slowly turning against him, as well as his less than savory antics, from his obvious alcoholism to his tendency to lie and exaggerate for no obvious reason besides clout. The video ended up being pretty successful, accruing almost 2 million views, as well as a very warm reception from practically everyone. While it didn't deal a major blow to Bert, it was yet another example of the slow but steady loss of reputation that Bert's been undergoing this past year. But all of that arguably paled in comparison to the potential prospects of what he might have achieved this year, as 2023 would see the release of Bert's biggest production yet, a big budget movie called The Machine. Back in 2019, a media company by the name of Legendary Entertainment bought the rights to Bert's famous story, The Machine. By then, the story had remained by far the most popular in Bert's arsenal, and he would recount it during every single stand-up, accompanied by cheers from his adoring fans, so making a movie out of it seemed fairly sensible. He, along with Judy Marmel, would begin producing the movie, and Bert would play himself. Besides the fact they got the director of Key and Peele, perhaps the most insane thing about the whole movie is that they somehow managed to get Mark Hamill to star as Bert's father.
I am flying to days on that plane to Serbia to start production on my major motion picture, The Machine. I got a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses to have a toast with the man playing my father. Just pulled up. What's up?
Wheels up in 5, big boy.
Oh, I thought we could do the I am your
Get on the plane.
It's not clear what kind of strings he pulled to get him on, but whatever the answer
Yeah,
is,
that's actually pretty impressive, I
one thing we can say for
guess.
sure is that he's got one hell of an act for networking. The movie began shooting in 2021 in Serbia and has spent 2 years in production. Once principal photography was finished, Sony began a massive advertising campaign with billboards, TV spots, etc. Burt himself would go on to promote the movie on more than one occasion, putting it in front of Joe Rogan's massive audience. In fact, Burt would go on to show a teaser of it to the JRE fans well before the teaser was even supposed to be released, to which Joe brings up quite a good point when asking if he's even legally allowed to show this. In the end, though, Burt manages to convince everyone it's above board, and they show the teaser, which is received well by everyone there. Joe Rogan would continue to be used as a platform to promote the movie well up until the movie's release in May of 2023. In the episode, Joe does a lot to compliment the movie, puffing it up, calling it funny, as you would expect. Burt, meanwhile, spends his time talking about his experiences making it, from discussing the kissing scenes, the way the premise was received, and perhaps most amusingly, he also says he ended up crying when he first watched it.
I was like, hey, Mark, secret time. I'm gonna cry watching myself. I'm gonna cry and I'm gonna mouth my lines. I did that when we did the first testing of the movie. They sat me in the front row. I had 2 bottles of wine. I sat with Leanne. I had a notebook. I was supposed to write things in for notes. The movie starts and I start bawling, crying, and I start mouthing my lines. I'm laughing hysterically. I'm like, I loved watching me more than a narcissist would ever. Like, it was like the craziest thing. So we go to the next screening. Kale, our producer, pulled me aside. He goes, I'm gonna ask you to sit in the back. I said, what? He goes, it kind of affect the way people watch the movie.
Okay, this is kind of weird
What
now.
do you mean? He goes, I don't know if they're fucking crying like it's Cape Fear but gay. He goes, fucking sit in the back. So
The movie opened in cinemas on the 26th of May to around 2,000 theaters. For the first time, we would finally get to see what unadulterated brilliance had been conjured up by these filmmaking juggernauts. The story, perplexingly, is not actually straight a retelling of The Machine as one might have expected. Instead, the plot centers around Burt in the current year having to return to Russia, where the original story of The Machine, which had happened in 1999 in this timeline, had caused quite a bit of stir in the Russian underground. He and his father are kidnapped by a vengeful Russian crime boss. The plot only gets more complicated as Burt and his father are roped into a power struggle over the control of a crime syndicate. And in the end, it all culminates in Burt ostensibly becoming John Wick, taking down bad guys while drunk off a bottle of vodka, which frankly I'm not even sure would get him buzzed at this point. The story is mostly just a vehicle to tell jokes, but perhaps the most interesting thing about it are the moments of introspection on Burt and the kind of person he is. The movie provides a critique of his frat boy persona, and the character of Burt comes to acknowledge that he has to become a better person for the sake of his family. I don't think I need to explain why I find this highly amusing given the kind of person Burt has shown himself to be, even well after this movie was done shooting. But yeah, he'd not really changed at all. The movie, beating the expectation of pretty much everyone involved, ended up being a massive flop. Despite being backed by Sony and heavily shelled for by Burt and Joe Rogan, it ended up making only about $5 million on its Memorial Day opening, and would only go on to gross over $10 million over its time in theaters. Compare that with its budget of $20 million, that means the movie only made back about half of its budget.
This is...
In the advertising budget, which we can assume is probably more or less than half the movie's budget, and Sony might have lost upwards of $30 million on this production. It ended up being such a failure that Sony pulled it out of theaters within 2 weeks, striking an emergency deal with Netflix in hopes they could recoup their losses there. How successful that was is anybody's guess, although with Netflix's track record with Burt's works, it might actually end up eking out a slight profit. But without solid numbers, which neither Netflix or Sony are
actually massive loss.
gonna share, it's really
Can
anybody's guess,
you-
but maybe if Burt gets drunk at some point on a podcast, he'll tell us. It's hard to attribute the failure of this movie to just one thing, although perhaps the largest problem the movie had to face was that there just wasn't much excitement for it. Legendary had bought the rights to this movie back when the Machine story was still in the mainstream, so it made sense to secure a deal back then. But internet fame has a short half-life, and with the story being proliferated across the web, it couldn't stay relevant for that long. And it certainly couldn't stay relevant enough for people who liked the story to then buy a movie ticket to see it. Of course, there were quite a few more problems worth pointing out. For one, it seems Sony, Burt, and even Joe severely overestimated the willingness of their audiences to seek this movie out. While Joe Rogan definitely would have the numbers to make this movie a hit, the truth is that Burt hasn't been very popular on JRE for a long time, with a lot of longtime fans finding him so annoying they'll outright skip a JRE episode to avoid him. That said, you could argue all these things would have been irrelevant if the movie had actually been anything exceptional. However, the impression you'll get is that it's anything from terribly middling to actually terrible. Put simply, it's exactly the kind of movie you'll forget half an hour after you walked out of the theater, with nothing about it that would hold your attention for any longer than the actual movie's runtime. And even at that, some people complain that it's somewhat of a drag to watch. Overall, this film was a total failure, and there are no two ways about it. The most it achieved is to bring even more attention to all of Burt's shortcomings, which only continued to mount in the eyes of the general public. More and more videos began being posted on YouTube documenting every supposed slight he's ever committed, every drama he's been involved in, etc. And indeed, his involvement in drama only got worse. In June 2023, on an episode of Two Bears, One Cave, where Burt was once again not present, his spot was filled in by Ari Shafir. And Ari breaks down a story about a bachelor party from Mark Norman, which he had gone to with Burt and Joe List. According to Ari, Burt had started off doing what he did best by being the life of the party, ordering food for everyone there. Joe List, though, didn't really want someone else ordering him food. Burt decided that he would order everyone Thai, and he walked over to the nearby Thai place 5 minutes away, apparently going to a bar while he waited for the food to be made. In the meantime, Joe ordered some pizzas. Burt would then call Joe, asking him to pick them up, which Joe accepted, albeit he wouldn't drive out until the pizzas arrived. A bit later, Joe received another call from Burt, during which he started screaming bloody murder at Joe for making him wait 2 hours, despite him only being gone for about an hour. Eventually, Burt and company were driven back to the party, where they found out Joe had ordered some pizzas. Once again, Burt went into an uncontrollable fit of rage, screaming and shouting at Joe as if he just skinned his childhood pet and served it to the guests, all the while the other guests just stared in shock at the ridiculous scene unfolding before them. During the podcast, Tom Segura would actually call Burt to personally confirm details of the story. To give Burt some credit, he did largely confirm Ari's story without
I
really
just describing,
trying
bruh.
to redress it, but he did try to deny that it was a meltdown, but after Ari's insistence, Burt gave in very quickly.
I'm Ari Shafir here. He's telling a story about you, and I go, I gotta confirm this. It's about a super aggressive meltdown you had at Mark Norman's bachelor party in Tampa about Thai food and pizza. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. So here's the story he told, that when you went to get Thai food with DeRosa, Liz showed up, but you flipped out that he was late, and then you walked back.
That's not how it worked. That's not how it worked.
Okay, yeah. And then you got back, you found out he ordered pizza, and you're like, what the you ordered Thai food, and that when Ari jumped in about it, you told him like to not, you screamed at him. That
No, I did not scream at him. I said, no, I did what I do when I go, I do it to Leanne too.
Yeah.
When I'm a little bit out of control and someone tries to help me,
Yeah.
I go, I need to get out of this hole myself. I didn't melt down, and by the way, I was
Yeah, you did. You melted, bro.
I melted down. Okay, I definitely melted down.
Hold on.
Frankly, perhaps the most shocking moment in the whole episode was when Ari pointed out that Burt had spent 2 hours at a bar getting drunk, and Burt actually full-on admitted to being an alcoholic. At first glance, it seemed this would be the end of the drama, but as it turns out, nothing's ever that simple with Bertkreischer. Shortly after the release of Two Bears, One Cave, Theo Von released an episode of This Past Weekend with Mark Norman, the man who had been in the middle of this drama when it originally happened. Early on in the episode, he mentioned how he was currently in a drama between two of his friends who kept coming to him to explain about one another. Even though Mark had been very deliberate in not naming anyone, Theo, once again proving he's much sharper than many give him credit for, susses out almost immediately that the two friends in question are Burt Bertkreischer and Joe List. Mark, seemingly both surprised and perturbed to have the two actually be named, changes the subject pretty quickly, seemingly unwilling to reveal any more about the situation than he's uttered. Eventually, Joe would go on the YMH podcast where he would talk to Tomsegura about his own perspective on what happened during that party. He mostly recounted the same as told by Ari, although he went out of his way to correct the misconception that he made Bert wait. Apparently, he had gone to pick him up immediately and only decided to order pizza while waiting for Bert to get the Thai food. Joe also says that Bert's claim about Joe saying no one wanted Thai food was false, which is why he ordered pizza quietly in the car while waiting, just as a second option in case anyone wanted it. Fundamentally, the two seem to have made up about the whole story by then, and Bert never came to counter Joe's version, somewhat vindicating it in the eyes of everyone. The situation itself was never really that big, other than in showing just how much of a Bert can be when he's drunk. But what is quite remarkable about it is that there wasn't a single person, not his closest friends and not a single neutral party, that actually came to Bert's defense. Everyone sided with Joe List, which just goes to show how fractured, if not entirely non-existent, his support group has really become. Perhaps the most obvious switch is seen with Tomsegura, as well as the entire Two Bears One Cave podcast. If you look through the list of the last few episodes, you'll notice that they really don't do a lot of podcasts anymore, with the large majority of the new Two Bears One Cave episodes having only one of the two hosts. In fact, they wouldn't share a single episode throughout October and most of November, meaning there hadn't been an episode in almost 2 months.
Yeah,
Oh, can I just say this real quick?
Yeah.
Every time we talk about like a watch or a car, I'll get a bunch of messages from losers that try to tell me that I'm making them feel bad about their situation. You're in control of your own situation and your own feelings. So don't put it on me that you feel bad that I have something that, oh, but I'm
I
struggling
guess
with the rent
so.
this month. Figure it the f out, okay? Like, don't make my life be a problem for your life.
Today, while the viewership for the show remains very strong by most standards, you can definitely see the viewership slipping in real time. Perhaps more worryingly, a cursory look at the most recent episodes where both Tom and Bert are present will quickly show that people kind of don't like these episodes. The reception is actually rather hostile. Frankly, it doesn't seem like Tom can even stand Bert anymore. In the second to last episode of Two Bears One Cave, Tom ends up making some pretty damning comments about Bert. For example, he admits they basically never talk outside of their podcast anymore, and that despite Bert's insistence, Tom has refused to go with Bert on any of his stand-up tours, flatly rejecting any opportunity to spend more time with him. He also mocks him quite openly, calling him retarded, and just seems to really not like Bert at all. With even his close acquaintances being tired of him, it's hard to see an upside for Bert at the immediate moment. I kind of feel bad for him, honestly. Like, he's just kind of been left out to dry, and even if it is his
He
fault,
doesn't want to involve with this guy, huh?
I don't know. You can't help but feel a little bad for someone in that position. It's not all bad, though, as the last podcast with Tom and Bert do show that Bert's seemingly trying to overturn his alcohol habit, mentioning in the sober episode how he'd stayed sober for 23 days. In light of all the controversy surrounding him these past few months, him trying to get his health back in order is at least a kernel of positivity. It's hard to find a success story quite like Bert's. A man destined to be a college dropout with zero prospects, a horrendous work ethic, and a reputation for being a degenerate frat boy. He managed to turn seemingly all these negative qualities into one of the most successful comic careers around, all built on the foundation of this one story, this one dubious legend from his past. There's never been any room for a man like Bertkreischer to succeed. He doesn't really fit into the picture, but in the
Yeah, I
end,
think he's doing good financially though.
and no matter how much he goes out of his way to sabotage his own reputation,
Maybe
that doesn't
alright.
change. Of course, despite all the things I've said about him, one thing worth acknowledging is that despite a steadily declining reputation, Bert really isn't that bad. Foolhardy and annoying as he may be, his controversies pale in comparison to other people in the industry, be it Crystalia or Brendan Schaub. In the same vein, while his reputation has taken a beating, Bert remains a pretty successful comedian today. Lest we forget, his latest tours have been selling out entire arenas, which has him knocking at the door of bona fide comedy legends. It remains to be
Maybe I
seen
should watch a documentary about Crystalia.
whether the damage to his reputation will eventually stabilize, or whether it's only a precursor to his eventual downfall. For now, though, let's just hope he sticks to his promise of exercising some temperance, and maybe he won't have quite so many people vying for his failure. I've been Turkey Tom, thanks for watching, and until next time, leave me alone.